Psilocybin exerts its primary effects on the brain by interacting with the serotonin system, specifically through activation of 5-HT2A receptors. These receptors are densely located in regions involved in higher-order cognition, including the prefrontal cortex, as well as in areas that contribute to the default mode network. This network plays a central role in maintaining your sense of self, internal dialogue, and habitual patterns of thinking. Under normal conditions, it operates in a highly organized and predictable way, reinforcing stable patterns of perception and belief. When psilocybin is introduced into the system, it is metabolized into psilocin, which closely resembles serotonin and binds to these 5-HT2A receptors with high affinity. This binding alters the way neurons communicate, particularly in cortical monadic responsible for integrating sensory and cognitive information. One of the key outcomes is a reduction in the usual synchronization within the default mode network. Instead of operating as a tightly coupled system, this network becomes less dominant and less rigid in its activity. At the same time, there is an increase in global connectivity across the brain. Regions that do not typically communicate strongly begin to exchange information more freely. This creates a more distributed and less hierarchical pattern of neural activity. In practical terms, it means that the usual top-down control exerted by higher-order brain regions is loosened, allowing for a broader range of signals, sensory, emotional, and cognitive, to interact in new ways. This shift is often described as an increase in neural entropy, reflecting a more flexible and less constrained state of brain function. This reorganization has significant effects on perception and cognition. Because the default mode network is less dominant, the brain's usual filters and predictive models are weakened. As a result, incoming sensory information can be experienced more directly, without being immediately categorized or interpreted based on past experience. This can lead to altered perceptions of time, space, and self, as well as novel associations between ideas that would not typically arise. Importantly, this does not mean that the brain is simply becoming disorganized. Rather, it is entering a different mode of operation, one that prioritizes exploration over stability. In this state, previously fixed patterns of thought, such as repetitive negative thinking or rigid beliefs, can become less entrenched. The brain is temporarily freed from its usual constraints, which can allow new perspectives and insights to emerge. However, this increased flexibility also means that the experience can be highly variable. Without the usual structure provided by the default mode network, the mind can generate a wide range of experiences, from deeply meaningful insights to confusion or anxiety. This variability is a direct result of the same mechanism that allows for potential therapeutic change, the loosening of rigid control. The key point is that psilocybin does not add something entirely new to the brain. It changes the way existing systems interact. By reducing the dominance of certain networks and increasing communication across others, it creates a temporary state in which the brain is more open, more flexible, and less bound by habitual patterns of activity. Psilocybin creates a state of heightened neuroplasticity, which means the brain becomes more capable of forming, modifying, and reorganizing connections between neurons. Under normal conditions, the brain tends to operate along well-established pathways that have been reinforced over time through repetition and experience. These pathways are efficient, but they can also become rigid, especially in conditions like depression or addiction, where certain patterns of thought and behavior are repeatedly activated. Psilocybin appears to temporarily loosen these constraints, allowing the brain to move out of its INU modes of operation. At the cellular level, activation of 5-HT2A receptors by psilocin triggers a cascade of intracellular processes that promote synaptic growth and remodeling. This includes increased expression of proteins associated with synaptic plasticity, as well as changes in how neurons form and maintain connections. Some research suggests that this can lead to the growth of new dendritic spines, which are small protrusions on neurons that facilitate communication between cells. These structural changes are thought to support the formation of new neural pathways, making it easier for the brain to encode new patterns of thinking and behavior. What makes this particularly important is the timing. The increase in plasticity is not limited to the acute experience while the substance is active. It can extend into a period after the experience, sometimes described as a window of plasticity during which the brain remains more adaptable than usual. During this time, experiences, thoughts, and behaviors can have a stronger influence on how neural circuits are shaped. This is why therapeutic frameworks often emphasize integration practices following psilocybin sessions, as the brain is more receptive to change. From a functional perspective, this heightened plasticity allows individuals to step outside of entrenched cognitive and emotional loops. For example, someone who is INEOA to interpreting situations through a negative lens may find that this pattern becomes less dominant. In its place, alternative interpretations can emerge, not because they are forced, but because the underlying neural pathways supporting them are now more accessible. This creates an opportunity to update beliefs and responses in a way that feels more natural and less effortful. There is also an interaction between plasticity and perception. During the psilocybin experience, the increased connectivity across brain regions allows for novel associations and insights. These experiences can be emotionally significant, which further enhances their impact on learning and memory. The combination of emotional salience and heightened plasticity makes it more likely that new perspectives will be encoded and retained. However, this increased malleability also means that the brain is more sensitive to context. The same mechanisms that allow for positive change can also reinforce negative experiences if the environment or mindset is not supportive. This is why guidance and structure are often emphasized in therapeutic settings, to help ensure that the plasticity is directed toward beneficial outcomes. Over time, the changes facilitated during this plastic state can become more stable, especially if they are reinforced through behavior and reflection. The brain gradually consolidates these new patterns, integrating them into its ongoing activity. This is how temporary shifts during a psilocybin experience can translate into longer-term changes in mood, perception, and behavior, not by overriding the brain's normal function, but by allowing it to update itself in a more flexible and adaptive way. The therapeutic potential of psilocybin is most evident in conditions where the brain becomes locked into rigid patterns of thought and behavior, such as depression, anxiety, and addiction. These conditions are not just defined by how someone feels, but by how consistently those feelings and thoughts repeat. In depression, for example, there's often a persistent loop of negative self-referential thinking, supported by overactivity in the default mode network. This creates a kind of mental rigidity where alternative perspectives are difficult to access, even when they are logically available. Psilocybin appears to interrupt these patterns by temporarily reducing the dominance of these rigid networks and increasing communication across different monadic of the brain. This shift allows individuals to experience their thoughts and emotions from a different vantage point. Instead of being fully immersed in negative thinking, they may observe those thoughts with a sense of distance or detachment. This change in perspective is often described as one of the most meaningful aspects of the experience, as it creates an opportunity to relate to internal experiences in a new way. In the context of depression, this can feel like a release from repetitive thought loops. The brain is no longer reinforcing the same misery over and over, and new interpretations or emotional responses can emerge. Some individuals report a sense of clarity or insight, where previously overwhelming problems become more manageable or are seen in a broader context. Importantly, these changes are not just fleeting experiences. When combined with proper support, they can lead to sustained improvements in mood and outlook. In anxiety, particularly forms tied to existential concerns or chronic worry, psilocybin can shift how fear is processed. Instead of avoiding or suppressing anxious thoughts, individuals may confront them in a different state of awareness, where the emotional intensity is altered. This can lead to a reduction in the perceived threat associated with those thoughts. In some cases, people report a greater sense of acceptance or peace, even when facing difficult realities. This is especially relevant in clinical settings involving serious illness, where anxiety is often tied to uncertainty and mortality. Addiction represents another area where psilocybin shows promise. Addictive behaviors are often driven by deeply ingrained habits and reward pathways that are difficult to change through willpower alone. By increasing neural flexibility and disrupting habitual patterns, psilocybin can create a window in which individuals reassess their relationship with substances or behaviors. This may involve recognizing underlying LSBAB, emotional triggers, or long-term consequences in a way that feels more immediate and impactful than abstract reasoning. A key factor across all these conditions is that psilocybin does not simply suppress symptoms. Instead, it appears to create conditions where the underlying patterns can be revisited and potentially restructured. This is why the experience itself is often combined with therapeutic guidance, helping individuals make sense of what arises and translate it into meaningful change. The outcomes, however, are not uniform. The same mechanisms that allow for positive shifts can also lead to challenging experiences if not properly supported. This is why careful screening, preparation, and integration are critical in therapeutic contexts. When these elements are in place, psilocybin can serve as a catalyst for change, helping individuals move out of rigid mental states and into more flexible, adaptive patterns of thinking and behavior. The effects of psilocybin are highly dependent on what is often referred to as set and setting, meaning your internal state going into the experience and the external environment in which it takes place. These factors are not just secondary influences. They are central to how the brain organizes the experience and whether the outcome is beneficial or distressing. Because psilocybin increases neural flexibility and reduces the usual constraints on perception and thought, the mind becomes more sensitive to both internal and external inputs. Set refers to your mindset, which includes your expectations, emotional state, intentions, and overall psychological condition. If someone enters the experience with a high level of anxiety, unresolved emotional tanav, or unclear intentions, those elements are more likely to shape the direction of the experience. This is because the usual filtering mechanisms in the brain are loosened, allowing underlying thoughts and emotions to surface more directly. On the other hand, a mindset that is prepared, stable, and open can help guide the experience toward exploration and insight, rather than confusion or distress. Expectations also play a significant role. The brain constantly uses prior beliefs to interpret incoming information, and under psilocybin, this interpretive process becomes more fluid. Positive expectations can create a sense of safety and curiosity, while negative expectations can amplify fear or uncertainty. This does not mean that the experience can be fully controlled, but it does mean that the starting point influences how the brain navigates the altered state. Setting refers to the physical and social environment. Because sensory processing is altered, external stimuli can have a much stronger impact than usual. A calm, predictable, and supportive environment helps reduce the likelihood of overwhelming or disorienting experiences. Elements like lighting, sound, and the presence of trusted individuals all contribute to how safe or unsafe the environment feels to the brain. In contrast, chaotic, unfamiliar, or uncomfortable settings can increase the chances of anxiety or panic, as the brain may interpret the environment as threatening. The presence of other people is particularly important. In therapeutic or guided contexts, trained facilitators provide reassurance and help individuals navigate difficult moments. Their role is not to control the experience, but to create a sense of safety that allows the person to move through challenging thoughts or emotions without becoming overwhelmed. Without this support, individuals may struggle to make sense of what they are experiencing, especially if the experience becomes intense. Another critical aspect is that psilocybin tends to amplify whatever is already present, rather than introducing entirely new content. If someone has unresolved emotional material, it may surface more vividly. In a supportive setting, this can be processed in a constructive way, leading to insight or relief. In an unsupportive setting, the same material can feel overwhelming or distressing. This amplification effect is a direct result of the increased connectivity and reduced filtering in the brain. Because of this sensitivity, set and setting are often carefully structured in clinical research and therapeutic applications. Preparation before the experience helps establish a stable mindset, and integration afterward helps make sense of what occurred. These elements work together to guide the increased neural flexibility toward meaningful outcomes. The key idea is that psilocybin does not operate in isolation. Its effects emerge from the interaction between the compound, the brain, and the environment. By shaping the internal and external conditions, you significantly influence how the experience unfolds and whether it leads to positive or negative results. Psilocybin carries real psychological risks, and understanding these is essential because the same mechanisms that allow for flexibility and insight can also produce intense and destabilizing experiences. By disrupting the normal organization of brain networks and reducing the filtering of thoughts and perceptions, psilocybin creates a state where the mind becomes more open but also more vulnerable. This can lead to experiences that are difficult to manage, especially in the absence of proper preparation or support. Or one of the most common risks is acute anxiety or panic during the experience. Because the usual sense of control is reduced, individuals may feel overwhelmed by the intensity of their thoughts, emotions, or sensory changes. This can include a sense of losing control, distorted perception of time, or a feeling of being disconnected from reality. While these effects are often temporary, they can be highly distressing in the moment and may lead to what is sometimes described as a bad trip. The likelihood of this increases when the environment is unpredictable or when the individual enters the experience with unresolved fear or tanav. Another important risk involves the potential to trigger more serious mansic health conditions in vulnerable individuals. People with a personal or family history of psychotic disorders, such as schizophrenia or certain forms of bipolar disorder, may be at higher risk. Psilocybin can amplify unusual patterns of thinking and perception, and in some cases, this may lead to prolonged episodes of psychosis or mania. This is why clinical settings place strong emphasis on screening participants before exposure, as the risks are not evenly distributed across all individuals. There is also the possibility of lingering psychological effects after the experience. While many people report positive and meaningful outcomes, others may experience confusion, hema, or difficulty integrating what they went through. In rare cases, perceptual disturbances can persist, such as changes in visual processing or heightened sensitivity to sensory input. These effects are not fully understood, but they highlight the importance of considering not just the acute experience, but also the period that follows. Another factor to consider is the unpredictability of the experience. Even with preparation, the effects of psilocybin can vary widely depending on dose, individual brain chemistry, and context. This variability makes it difficult to guarantee a specific outcome. What feels manageable for one person may be overwhelming for another, and even the same individual may have very different experiences at different times. There are also behavioral risks during the experience itself. Because perception and judgment are altered, individuals may misinterpret their surroundings or act in ways they normally would not. In unsafe environments, this can lead to accidents or harmful situations. This is one of the reasons supervised settings are emphasized in research and therapeutic use, as they help minimize these risks. Importantly, the intensity of psilocybin's effects means that it is not a passive experience. It requires a level of psychological readiness and the ability to navigate challenging internal states. Without this, the experience can become destabilizing rather than beneficial. Understanding these risks does not negate the potential benefits, but it does highlight that psilocybin is a powerful tool that must be approached with caution, awareness, and the long-term benefits of psilocybin are not determined solely by the experience itself, but by how that experience is processed and integrated afterward. Integration refers to the process of taking the insights, emotions, and perspectives that emerge during the altered state and translating them into meaningful, lasting changes in daily life. Without this step, even profound experiences can fade over time or remain disconnected from actual behavior and decision-making. During the psilocybin experience, the brain enters a state of increased flexibility, where habitual patterns are loosened and new associations can form. This often leads to insights that feel clear and significant in the moment. However, insight alone does not guarantee change. The brain tends to return to its established patterns unless those new perspectives are reinforced through action and reflection. Integration is what bridges this gap, turning temporary shifts in perception into more stable neural and behavioral patterns. One of the key aspects of integration is reflection. This involves revisiting the experience in a structured way, whether through journaling, conversation, or guided therapy. By articulating what was felt and understood, you engage cognitive processes that help organize and consolidate those insights. This strengthens the neural pathways associated with them, making it more likely that they will influence future thinking and behavior. Without this step, the experience may remain vague or difficult to access over time. Another important component is behavioral alignment. If the experience highlights certain patterns, such as unhealthy habits, limiting beliefs, or misaligned priorities, then making concrete changes in response is essential. This could involve adjusting routines, changing relationships, or adopting new practices that reflect the insights gained. These actions reinforce the new patterns at both a psychological and biological level, helping to stabilize them within the brain's ongoing activity. Social and therapeutic support can also play a critical role. Discussing the experience with someone who understands the process can help clarify its meaning and prevent misinterpretation. In some cases, the experience may bring up complex or challenging material that requires careful processing. Supportive contexts provide a framework for working through these elements in a way that promotes growth rather than confusion. Timing is another factor. The period following a psilocybin experience is often characterized by increased neuroplasticity, meaning the brain is more receptive to change. Engaging in integration practices during this window can enhance their effectiveness, as the brain is more capable of forming and strengthening new connections. This makes it an ideal time to establish new habits or ways of thinking that align with the insights gained. It's also important to recognize that not all insights are immediately clear or accurate. Some may require time and evaluation before they can be fully understood. Integration involves a process of sorting through the experience, identifying what is meaningful and applicable, and letting go of what is not. This prevents overgeneralization or the adoption of ideas that may not be beneficial in the long term. When integration is done effectively, the experience becomes part of an ongoing process of change rather than an isolated event. The brain incorporates the new patterns into its regular functioning, leading to shifts in mood, perception, and behavior that persist over time. This is what allows psilocybin, when used appropriately, to have lasting therapeutic effects, not because of a single moment, but because of how that moment is carried forward into everyday life. When integration is approached with consistency and intention, the value of the experience extends far beyond the temporary state it produces. It becomes a catalyst for ongoing change, where insights are translated into actions and reinforced over time. This is ultimately what determines whether psilocybin leads to lasting benefits or remains a short-lived shift in perception, as the brain stabilizes around the patterns that are actively practiced and embodied after the experience.